is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Are Washington State's K-12 students falling behind amid the pandemic? Who's keeping tabs on their academic performance, and what kind of tests and measurements are being used to do that? Those are some of the big questions education reporter Joy Resmovits set out to answer in a new series for the Seattle Times Education Lab. She's here to share what she learned. Joy, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to talk to you, Emily.
Well, we're glad you could make the time. I want to start with the nut graph. You asked 18 districts across the state for data on whether students are getting ahead or falling behind. What did you learn?
I learned that districts are dealing with a lot right now, and perhaps tracking academics is not their number one priority at the moment, which is fair. Nobody trained to teach or administer or provide food or internet to students through a pandemic. In the places where I was able to get data, I did learn a bit about who's getting the most out of the school year and who's getting the least. There were some signs that students who are living in poverty are engaging less with school. And one of the most interesting findings to me is that in one big district, we found that students who were underperforming before the pandemic were least likely to return and take the same tests during the pandemic, which is a bit worrisome when you think about what things are going to look like when we return to the classroom.
When you say return and take the same tests, so are these state-level achievement tests that normally would have been given during the course of the year?
No, I'm glad you asked that. These are what are called interim exams, which districts often use to keep track of student performance internally. There are a lot of conversations about data in education, and one of the buzzwords or buzz terms is having actionable data that's not used for accountability purposes, but that can help teachers know what their students need. This is that kind of thing.
So here's my next question. When you say they didn't take the test, were they just absent on the day that the test would have been given, or are they absent altogether?
That we don't know from this data specifically. But the thing that makes me confident about what we did find, though, is that in this case, we have the privilege of analyzing data at the student level. So we're able to say not just what the aggregate group change was in a calculation that might be obscured by population change from year to year, which happens with education data, but we're able to say with certainty that these actual students who were marked as either being on free or reduced price lunch before the pandemic or below grade level didn't come back.
What is the state of Washington requiring districts to do right now in terms of tracking how students are performing and also reporting it?
They're not involved at all. I knew that part of the guidance that the state issued to districts before the start of the school year was that districts had to administer some kind of what they call the universal screener to check up on students' socio-emotional well-being as well as their academics. But I later learned that the state didn't require any reporting on what they found and what instruments they used to figure it out.
Is this unusual for Washington State? How involved is the state education department generally in terms of keeping tabs on districts?
That could be a whole podcast of its own, so I'll try to keep it short. We've had a superintendent here, a state superintendent, Chris Reichel, who said, I'm doing what I can, but the state doesn't enshrine enough power in this office for me to do what I need. But also within those constraints, we haven't seen them take a whole lot of initiative on data collection in particular to find out what was happening during the pandemic in terms of the basics. Where are students right now? They administered a voluntary survey and reported the results in a way that wasn't clean. That took a lot of work on our end with Dahlia Bazaz and Lauren Flannery to figure out what it was saying in aggregate. So I would say it wasn't shocking.
You do mention that one of the districts actually did a pretty good job at collecting the data and then sharing it with you, and that was Tacoma. What did you find out?
So Tacoma was a district I mentioned earlier. They shared a giant spreadsheet with student-level data on a test called the iReady, which is an interim diagnostic test that's administered a couple of times a year to see what students know and what they need to know to get to or above grade level. I was glad that, if there was only going to be one district that was giving us this level of data, I'm glad it was Tacoma because they're the third biggest in the district, at least as of the most recent enrollment numbers, by a very small margin. They're close to the second, but they're also quite diverse.
Were they willing to have you sort of crunch those numbers and give feedback before the story ran to get their reaction, or did they just sort of give you this data dump and run?
Interesting question. So it was actually the Public Records Office that gave us the data dump. So I then had to follow up with the district PIO to say, okay, we have this data. And he didn't even know what the data was, which is an interesting conversation on, the healthy boundaries that should or shouldn't exist between a PIO and a Public Records Office. Different districts handle that differently, but they didn't even know what the district records officer had handed me. So I said, thank you so much for what you've given me. You win the Joy Resmovits Transparency Award for interim academic data this year. Now we've done these calculations. It's a giant spreadsheet. We want to make sure we did the right thing. What can we do? And it took a bit of time to schedule that call. And to be honest, our stories were supposed to run a week earlier, which would have been the weekend after the insurrection and the mob at the U.S. Capitol. I was, in the long run, really grateful that the story didn't run when it did, not for the reason, but the fact that it gave us more time because it was taking a while to get that particular group of people in Tacoma on the phone. And it would have been harder to sleep at night before publication if we hadn't had that conversation. Not a whole lot changed as a result of it, but we knew we had a data dictionary. We knew we were interpreting the terms correctly, thanks to the good questions my collaborator and data honcho, Manuel Villa, asked. And we were able to say to them very specifically, this is what we found, and this is what we will be saying in the story. We don't want you to be surprised.
Your story has 3 parts, and they run on successive days. The first part is what we've been talking about, which is what Washington districts are doing in terms of trying to quantify student achievement during the pandemic and the state's role. Also, a separate story on what testing in the state might look like mid and post-pandemic. And then you had, third, a really lovely feature, a visit to a school that's taking a different approach to remote learning, using what's known as an acceleration model, which is you just keep sort of forging ahead. And if kids miss material, you catch up later, but you don't stop and try to catch them up on the scene. This was a huge undertaking. Did you expect to do it in 3 parts like that at the start?
No, I thought of this as one story. For me, this started with a very basic question. How are students doing right now? Which shouldn't be that hard to answer, but it turns out it is. And in the process, because it did involve so many conversations with different districts, you kind of hear things that could be interesting. And I remember my first call with Highline with their chief academic officer. They were pretty transparent with me. They gave me their iReady presentation. They made their staff available. And I asked them, what are you doing? What's your approach? And what's working? And they bristled when I used the term learning loss because they said, we're actively trying to prevent that from happening. And we're using this strategy. And as I heard them talk, I thought, this sounds like it will take more than a couple of graphs to explain. I asked them to connect me to some educators. And as soon as I had that call with the teachers that we featured and with the principal, and there were some more people on that call, I knew immediately, I need to get into this classroom, see what's happening, and report, more than that overall broader level of data analysis, but show what success can look like.
You said on Twitter that, quote, the learning loss conversation has been tied with the push to reopen schools. That's not what this story is. What do you mean by that?
Right now, and for the last couple of months, the conversation around school reopening has been really tense. I'm not a parent, so I can't personally speak to how stressful it must be to be going through this school year, no matter your situation. So I think there's an impulse that I've seen to tie the lack of metrics on learning or the lack of successful online learning to the desire to reopen schools. But I think those things aren't necessarily connected. I think Melinda Anderson was one of the first people to point out, the kind of flawed math in that equation. Because to be blunt, it felt like there was a week when, all these fancy, mostly white columnists were writing about how, the science is so clear and we all need to be back in school right now because poor students and students of color were struggling. Well, there's a big caveat on the science, which is that community spread matters. And it's not a black and white thing. But secondly, for those people to say what the system needs to do in response to the needs of students of color that they weren't necessarily talking to me, that's a really hubristic assumption that ties their needs and desires to communities that they might not know. And in the course of reporting the story and reporting in general, I found that, of course, this is not the optimal and most ideal situation, but there are families and families of color who are thriving. We had an op-ed from a couple of local scholars and community organizers that said there are families of color whose kids are safer and happier learning from home because they're not dealing with the racial microaggressions and perhaps, a white teacher who can't relate to them or says things that are inappropriate. So I just wanted to be really careful about saying these are stories about what students are learning right now. It is not a referendum on what the structure of our school system should be now and for years to come.
I also think it's interesting that these conversations have sort of devolved into, we shouldn't be holding schools accountable or punish them if students fall behind. That, of course, a lot of students are going to fall behind simply because of the circumstances, many of which are beyond schools' control. But that's different than saying we're going to at least make, a modicum of effort to try to track what's happening so we can use that information potentially in a really positive way later on.
That's exactly right. And that's why I wrote the story about standardized testing, because having observed education policy for a while now, I think the idea of testing gets so wrapped up in this ball of yarn with accountability and scary words and scary actions that don't always happen. I think there was this period in the early 2010s when some states and districts were trying to tie teacher evaluations to student growth measures and value added. And we all know what happened with that. And so it's a hard conversation to have to truly pull out, just this is pure data and we should be looking at it because it's better to know than not know. And how can you make policy or financial allocation decisions at a moment when we're all hurting without knowing who needs it the most? So I think, it is my responsibility as a journalist to make sure that we share, even if it is incomplete, imperfect diagnostic data with the appropriate caveats. And I think that also is one of the reasons I was so interested in that Highline district, because those are teachers who look at their data closely. They talk to students about it, but it's from a perspective of building strength. It's from an optimistic perspective where they have a lot of heart and they're telling students, hey, you have some ownership in your academic journey. Maybe you want to retake this test, but I know you can do better. I've built a relationship with you. Let's see how you're doing and how we can get you to the finish line or beyond.
You've talked with parents about how they're feeling about how things are going, and it seems like a lot of them really want to answer that question, but they're not sure. They're in the dark on what they're supposed to be watching for and measuring. Tell us a little bit about what you heard from them.
I heard such a mixed bag. I'll tell you, actually, I had initially planned to start the story with a different family. They had such an interesting story that related more cleanly to my nut graph, and it kind of wrote itself. It was a family where the kids had been doing well last year in school. This year they were doing poorly and everything was terrible. That family ghosted me after hours of conversation, and it forced me to do more outreach, which I think was, of course, hard and frantic in the moment, but made the story ultimately better. Because I think it's possible to say, my child seems like he's doing well from what I see, from what I observe learning looks like, but it's different from where he was a year ago. But I don't know how the district is doing. I don't know how my kid, who is Black, stacks up in a district that's mostly white, and it's important for me to know.
We're talking with Joy Resmovits of the Seattle Times about learning loss for Washington State students amid the pandemic. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who's taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Joy, one of the key prongs, I think I would say, of Seattle's Education Lab is to take a solutions approach to reporting. And I would say that definitely came out in the second story in your series, and that was about Highline Elementary, where third graders are learning online using this acceleration model. Can you give us the nut graph on that story?
Sure. What was interesting to me there is that they're using this term and a strategy called acceleration, which historically has been reserved for gifted students in programs that have a history of being segregated. And they're seeing that it can work for everyone. That if you keep students moving and boost them ahead without saying, hey, you were home for all of last spring and didn't get much instruction, so you, third grader, we're starting you in second grade this year, they're not doing that because they think that'll hold students back.
And it was interesting to me for you to sort of describe these moments. And one of the things was pacing seems to be a really big deal for this model. And that really came through in the story.
Oh, yeah. It was clear from my first moment in their classes that this was a fight against the clock. I haven't seen any good data on this, but those teachers said that they have at least one third less time with their students in that one case. And I think that's a universal thing with distance learning, is that because there's all this asynchronous time, you're for the most part getting less face time with your students in class. And beyond that, you're also not getting those hallway interactions or those between class interactions where you're building your relationship, finding, some things that they love that you might not love, but that you care about them enough to pretend to like Roblox or Naruto or some other fandom like that, right? So the teachers are working really, really hard against these constraints to build relationships, to the point where they actually took some class time in the beginning of the year because they noticed that when they put students in breakout rooms, they didn't really know how to engage with the material or with each other in this new bizarre world and setting. So they used valuable class time to set things up so that students could eventually coach each other, give each other feedback, and teach each other.
I'm curious, was there any past reporting you did or training that helped you prepare professionally to dig into these numbers? I know you did have a data reporter to work with you on this, but you also had to do a lot of number crunching on your own.
Well, shouts to EWA diving into data. I really recommend it. I will admit, when I went back to reporting this October, I felt like I was at a disadvantage with data just because I hadn't been in as many data sets from where I was sitting. I just felt weak in that sense. So I really wanted to tackle that weakness, sign myself up for some training, reacclimate myself with Excel. And actually, my first reported story was pretty data heavy, looking at enrollment changes, learned that old percent change formula, starting with the basics. So diving into data not only made it less scary for me, but also talking to experts as well. A lot of people who weren't even quoted in the story took a look, and I talked to them. I looked at the spreadsheets. I tried to understand what they were saying, and it helped me understand what I should be asking, what we should be asking these data sets for. Because even if you know all the formulas, you're not going to get anywhere if you don't understand like the bigger picture. What does this represent? What does iWriting mean? How is it different from a summative test? And, why are the scores bouncy? We wound up not reporting so much on the score changes because they seemed so bouncy between the different administrations over the course of the year on iReady that we didn't know what to make of them, and we didn't want to sow concern or alarm where we weren't 100% sure what the numbers were telling us. So we thought that engagement and who gets lost and who comes back was a better metric, especially when contextually we know that a lot of students are still struggling with broadband access.
At the top of our conversation, you did mention that students who were already struggling appear to have had the toughest time making this adjustment. I don't think that was necessarily a surprise to anyone, including you, but I am wondering, were there some surprises in this story?
I would say number one, the degree of that difference was a surprise to me. In terms of students who returned in Tacoma, it was, I think, 78% of students who were performing at or above grade level in January, the last administration of the iReady before the pandemic, were engaged enough to come back this October. Of students below grade level, just 59% came back. That is a pretty profound difference, right? So I wasn't expecting to see that degree of change. I don't know if this was surprising so much. You could expect it, but the degree of increased fails in a couple of districts, but also from statewide organizations that were seeing this in the schools that they were working with, not just the number of students who are failing are increasing, and the number of students with more F grades apiece are also increasing. And I didn't have the space to get into it in these stories, which I know is laughable given how many words are in them. But the fact that, what does it mean to have an F grade during a pandemic? What is that really showing us? And how are teachers thinking about it? And how do you kind of hold steady to make sure that you're graduating students with the skills they need to succeed, but balance that out with the fact that this was a major life interruption and perhaps they're learning some skills that can't be measured, or perhaps there are some things that are interfering with their home environment that make it impossible for them to learn in a safe way.
So, Connecticut Education Commissioner Miguel Cardona is President Joe Biden's pick to lead the federal Department of Education. Commissioner Cardona has called the closure of schools in Connecticut a public emergency, and he called on districts to share extensive data on what was known about the kids who are losing ground, especially those who are already underserved. What's your take on that?
My bias is always toward knowing more. So I'm glad to know that the person taking over our country's school system in a broader sense believes in trying to find out things, even when the things that they tell you might be painful to look at. I will say I'll be curious to see how this plays out in the particulars. As you probably know, the NAEP has been suspended for this school year, which is the only national test that provides comparable data. On the other hand, Washington is one state that will be asking again for a waiver from statewide testing. And there are many arguments that they're making, but one of them that our state superintendent has as well, if the federal government can't do a NAEP, which is a smaller sample, then why are they expecting us to do this giant test? So I'll be interested to see how he handles that question.
Community engagement is a big piece also of the Seattle Education Lab model. And I noticed online that you've got a quick survey for people to sort of chime in and ask questions and share ideas. How else are you keeping the conversation going with your readers?
You have good timing, Emily. Just yesterday, Jen Smith, our fabulous engagement editor, and I had a lovely Zoom with our third grade teacher and principal friends, which, by the way, highly recommend at the end of a long day. Will put a pep in your step and a smile on your face. But we're talking about, how do we continue this conversation? Because we asked them, what was your feedback on the story, which is always fun as a reporter to be in a Zoom room with people you wrote about. But it is healthy, right? And it's a good gut check. And it was mostly positive that they said, we did hear from some teachers who said, we read the story, but we didn't really learn from the story exactly how to implement these strategies in our classroom. And of course, I'm not primarily writing for teachers, and there's a limit to how specific I can get in that sense. But that's really good feedback for us. So we're now talking about doing a potential live virtual event with these educators. We're still figuring out the shape of it, but we're thinking about doing something that's more for teachers that, is a very informal, fun kind of PD where they can learn from these educators who've, since our story is published, gotten emails from people wanting to learn more about their work from places as far as New Jersey and North Carolina. So we're wondering, can we model a student data session? Can we show what that classroom would look like? Can we ask them some questions, facilitate breakout conversations so that teachers can come back with lessons and apply them to their work?
Okay, Joy, I want you to open up that reporter's notebook on your desk, or maybe it's a file on your phone, and tell me, what are the questions you still want to get answered on this story?
Oh my God, so many. Well, number one, I'm going to be blunt here and say I still have not gotten any data from Seattle Public Schools. I got an email just this week saying, hey, we're going to need another week on your public records request. So I would like to see how our state's biggest school district is doing, and I hope that they provide that data soon. Number two, there's a whole other window into student performance that we could get at, which is that in Washington, there's a new law that requires screening of literacy for dyslexia and other disabilities at the early grade. So that is one kind of longer term thing that we can be looking at. Another big thing here is I want to go deeper on this question of grading policy. Last spring, the state softened the grading rules and districts could basically do whatever they wanted. This year, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot more failures. And I'd like to delve into this and see what it means to be failing or marked as failing during a pandemic. And beyond that, how are districts beginning to rethink their grading policies as a result of what they're observing right now and who is getting marked as failing and how their home environment affects that. And then in a bigger picture, I think the big question right now everywhere is the sequential nature of school is changing. Systemically, we have a significant percentage of families who simply did not put their kids into public kindergarten. Obviously, that has a financial impact, but more importantly, how is the system going to respond when we have, already concerns about a potential teacher shortage and getting people back into buildings in a safe and distanced way? How is the system going to respond to people who took an unexpected gap year before college, or, people who didn't apply right out of high school for the Seattle Promise, which is a free community college program? I'm curious to see can this system shed one of its fundamental natures and the stiffness with which it says, you have to know this at the end of this grade, and if you don't, well, maybe get a GED. That's a longer term focus that I want us to pay more attention to.
For reporters who want to follow your substantial lead, what are a couple of story ideas they could take away with them now?
I would say ask your state how they're looking at student learning. I would have saved a lot of time if I lived in a place like Connecticut, potentially, where the state is collecting more. There might be an easy story to knock off based on what's available, but that they're not releasing. From there, pick a couple of districts in a strategic way that might represent the demographics of the state or give you a big cut of the population, and start with the PIOs, ask for data, and if you don't get it, move on to PRAs. If this is helpful to you at all, just expect that the PRAs will take a long time to craft because it's not apparent from many district sites what their testing vendor is. So you might have to look at their testing contracts or district handbooks or board meetings, which I spent a lot of time doing. And even then, I kind of swung and missed in a few cases, but I'm grateful for the records officers who said, actually, you won't fish anything back with that wording because we've actually changed vendors since you last checked. So just, expect that this work will take a lot of time.
Joy Resmovits is a reporter with the Seattle Times Education Lab. She's also an EWA board member. Joy, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Emily, on and off the air.
Thank you, Joy. And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.